Giving to the needy. Be careful not to do your acts of righteousness before men, to be seen by them. If you do, you will have no reward from your Father in heaven. So when you give to the needy, do not announce it with trumpets, as the hypocrites do in the synagogue and on the streets, to be honoured by men. I tell you the truth, they have received their reward in full. But when you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret. Then your Father, who sees what is done in secret, will reward you. And when you pray, do not be like the hypocrites, for they love to pray, standing in the synagogues and on the street corners to be seen by men. I tell you the truth, they have received their reward in full. But when you pray, go into your room, close the door and pray to your Father who is unseen. Then your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. And when you pray, do not keep on babbling like pagans, for they think they will be heard because of their many words. Do not be like them, for your Father knows what you need before you ask him.
So as you know, for this term, we started a series called Gospel Plus, looking at how people add to the gospel and adding things that end up damaging the core message. And so far this series, we've looked at two examples of how this happens, how we see this in churches today. We firstly looked at the prosperity gospel and this idea that if you give to God, if you give to the church, and if you say lots of positive things, and if you think positive thoughts, then because of that, because you do these things, then God will reward you. Because of your positivity, he'll give you good health and he'll give you wealth and you'll be blessed by him in these worldly ways. But then last week, we looked at what is the total opposite. And this one was not about prosperity, but instead it was about poverty. This is about having nothing. And this is the one where people end up saying, see how little I've got. This shows how much faith I have. The fact that I have so little in life, this is proof that I am a true follower of God. That by not having anything, they think that this shows just how much more faithful they are than others, as their poverty, their hardships. Well, it shows how much they've been willing to sacrifice for their faith. And it shows how the world has rejected them because of that faith. Which means that the people who have it easy in life, they're therefore sold out to the world, like those who follow the prosperity gospel. Where these people, in contrast to that, they have a hard life because they're so faithful and because they're committed to God. But as mentioned last week, when you get down to it, when you look at what both of these distorted gospels teach and what they stand for, well, they both actually have the same sin issue at heart. They're both about showing off and making our relationship with God something that you earn. So whether your life is all good, like the prosperity gospel that we saw a couple of weeks ago, or if your life is all bad, like the poverty gospel that we looked at just last Sunday, they are both all about having pride in how much commitment you have to God. They're both about showing off to everyone and using worldly wealth or a lack of wealth as a measurement of personal faith. And that sin issue is what moves us to today's topic, which is the pride gospel itself. A distorted gospel that has people living their life for the purpose of showing everyone else how faithful they are. Where people don't do things out of personal conviction or out of true submission to God or anything else that would come from a godly motive. But instead, this is about doing things only for the purpose of getting everyone else to look at you and go, wow, look how faithful you are. Look how much you live for God. I wish I could be like you. I wish I had the kind of faith that you do. And then because they get all this positive validation, because people think and speak well of them, and they are seen as being truly faithful people, well, this then leads them to think that because they have done all these good things, that has gotten them all this praise, then this must mean that they are good enough for salvation. That because they've ticked the right boxes, they've now earned their place in heaven by their works. And we're seeing this passage here that Jesus very much warns against this. He says that this attitude, it is not right for a Christian to have this, and it is not believing the true gospel. In fact, this kind of attitude is actually the very opposite of how a Christian is to live, and it makes a mockery of what true faith should be. Because when it comes to salvation, we're not saved by doing good things, but instead it is because we're saved that we now do what is right. That it doesn't matter what other people think. It doesn't matter how we might appear. But all that matters is what God sees of us and how he knows why we do these things. And when we reverse this, when we turn this around and make it about our actions and appearances, then we now make our faith actually about ourselves, and it becomes personal pride, and it's no longer about Jesus. We end up losing what is the true gospel, and we turn it into what is essentially works religion and about building our reputation and looking right. And this issue becomes very obvious when we look at what Jesus says here in our passage. And we get some clear examples that Jesus gives here of how people get this wrong and why it is such a big issue. And why we all need to be very careful not to get full of pride and start showing off for others, and for them to then admire our faith, as doing that, it ultimately leads to nowhere. So quickly look at the passage that we just had read out, and looking at the examples given here and the warnings given here, we see in verses 2 to 4 that Jesus says this. He says, "So when you give to the needy, do not announce it with trumpets, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and on the streets, to be honored by others. Truly I tell you, they have received their reward in full. But when you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret. Then your Father, who sees what is done in secret, will reward you." So what's going on here is there are people who are in need. They have no food or clothes, or they're very sick or elderly, and they can't look after themselves. So they obviously need help. They need someone to support them. And this was a very common thing in Israel at that time. Back then in Israel, when Jesus was speaking to these people, there was no social welfare or government support programs like we have in Australia today. So if you had nothing back then, and if you couldn't look after yourself, then you would be in a lot of trouble. And you had to rely 100% on the charity of others just to survive. So these people that Jesus is warning about here are people who come along, they see these people in need, and they do help them. They see they're in need, and they give them food and clothes and help people to move from place to place who are too sick to move by themselves. And then once they've done this good thing, once they've done that, they then go out and they say, "See how I help these people. See how I gave food to this person and clothes to this person. See how I help these people in need." They go around telling everyone that they've helped all these people. So everyone will then see what good people they are. People then see how godly they are because of their good works. But just as bad as that is that there may be other times when they may see someone in need. They might see someone begging and needing help. But in those situations, they do nothing for them. They see someone begging for food, but they just walk past. And that's because these people who need help, well, they're down some empty street. They're on some road between towns. They're in some area where no one sees them. They're not sitting there at the gates of the temple or sitting out the front of the local synagogue where everyone can see them asking for help. And because they're hidden, because they're out of sight, if you help them, no one's going to see you give food to them. If no one's going to see it, why bother? Why help someone if no one will see it? So there's no one there to praise you for what you've done. So these people only help those who are in crowded areas. They're only helping those who are in busy areas so other people can see the good deed. And that means that there is absolutely no love in this action. They don't do any of this to help those in need. Instead, they're just doing it for recognition. They're doing it so other people will see them and say, "You are such a good person. You're such a godly person. Look how you help those in need. You're a role model." And sadly, this is a very common thing in our society today. And with the advent of social media, we're seeing this more and more. We see all the time people telling people and showing everyone how much they've helped others. So they do something good and then they go on the internet and they can't wait to demonstrate to everyone how much they've been helping those in need. And many of them are even creating staged videos designed to get maximum impact and give them the best possible reputation by how they're portrayed on those videos. And then worse still, after they've shown everyone how good they are, they can often be quick to call other people out and say, "Well, you need to do more. You need to be more like me. See how I help people and you don't. How you need to do more for those in need like I do." And the problem with all this is, whilst it is in some ways genuine charity, and people may actually be getting helped in these situations, so there is some actual good going on here, all of this is still false and it's all fake in motive. And it actually all comes from what is a perverted sense of pride. This is all about looking good. It's about getting praise of others and looking righteous. And it's why we sometimes then hear these disappointing stories about all this good work getting done and that there are thousands of people that were helped. But then you find out that it wasn't 1,000 people, it was only 100. And that the $1 million claimed to have been given to a charity was maybe just in the tens of thousands of most. And then we see these charities that claim to give out millions of dollars. But in reality, they only give out a fraction of it, as most of it goes to administration costs. And because you're doing it for the camera, if you're doing it and doing everything for people's praise, then exaggerating the amount of stuff that you've done, making it look more than what it really is, well, it's a logical tactic. If you're doing it to get the praise of people, the more you exaggerate what you do, the more praise you're going to get. And it's a sad thing. And we do see this far too often. And when Christians do it, it becomes even worse. Because when Christians do it, it's about looking more Christian than anyone else without actually acting like a Christian. It's not about showing the true love of Jesus. Instead, it's about making what is a false statement and claiming having true faith in Jesus and doing this to be like Jesus, doing this because you love these people so much, despite the fact that is not why you're doing it at all. It's not about them. It's not about Jesus. It is just for the praise. And they're actually doing this all for themselves. And they're not doing this for those who they are supposedly helping. But then when we read our passage here, we see that Jesus is saying that being fake, doing that kind of stuff, looking for that praise, it wins you no praise from God. That this is not what we've been called to do. And in fact, it's the very opposite of what it is to be truly faithful. And that's why Jesus says here, he says, when you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret. And what he obviously means by this is to help people because it's simply the right thing to do. Don't do it to be seen by others. In fact, when you do this, try to keep it secret. Keep it secret so you don't get praised and you can't be using it to build your reputation. Don't do this kind of stuff because God cares nothing for that kind of behavior. He doesn't want us to be showing off. He wants us to be genuine. He wants us to do it because we truly love him and we truly love those we're helping. And as we go on in the passage, we see a very similar thing being said about prayer. That when we pray, or if we do anything out of devotion to God, that we shouldn't show off because it becomes a meaningless act if we do that. See what Jesus says in our passage here from verse 5. He says, "And when you pray, do not be like the hypocrites, for they love to pray, standing in the synagogues and on the street corners to be seen by others. Truly, I tell you, they've received their reward in full. But when you pray, go into your room, close the door, and pray to your Father who is unseen. Then your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. And when you pray, do not keep on babbling like pagans, for they think they'll be heard because of their many words. Do not be like them, for your Father knows what you need before you ask him." See, just like helping others, people also like to put on a show when it came to acts of religious devotion. And this was a big theme all through the Old Testament. This is an issue that gets raised all the time and something very sternly warned against. So when we look back at the nation of Israel, we see that when it came to their sacrifices, when it came to holding all those laws, we see that many in Israel did everything to look the part, even if they didn't actually care about what they were doing. That they didn't actually want to worship God, but they simply did what was expected of them. They just went along with the cultural norm and they did it to look righteous by these public displays. Hence why we get this famous quote from Isaiah 29, where it says in verse 13, "These people come near to me with their mouth and honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. Their worship of me is based on merely human rules that they have been taught." And this is something that Jesus himself would quote later on in this very book of Matthew in chapter 15. And he quotes it when he's talking about the Pharisees and the teachers of the law because of their actions that were empty of any sincerity. Because just like their ancestors, they too talked up their religious devotion. And they wanted to make a point of how much they honor God. But when they did this, it was nothing but theater to build up their own reputation. They didn't genuinely worship God. And that's why we see here in our passage this morning that when it came to praying, talking to God, that same issue is now being brought out. It's the same problem being played out again. And again, this too was about looking closer to God and looking devoted to him as opposed to actually really knowing him and really caring about his ways. This was also about going for the praise of people and building the godly reputation and having actual faith. So how this would look in practice is, in their private life, when they're at home, they don't pray. And when they need something, they don't pray. And they don't think about God. They don't care about him. But then in public, when people are watching them, that's when they get up, make these long prayers, so people will look at them and they'll say, "Look how godly you are. Look at how you pray." And then they'll say, "These people must have so much faith, and I wish I was like them," and how committed they are. So again, just like helping those in need, this all ends up becoming a performance. And this is all pride-driven. It's not real. Instead, it's about looking good. It's about just getting the praise of others. And this is a common thing in many ways today. Many people go to church, not to worship God, but so others will say, "Oh, they're a good person. They're a person of faith. They go to church every week. Look at how much they're up front, praying, declaring God's ways." And this is why we often see many celebrities, politicians, people in power around the world telling everyone how faithful they are. They make a big show of their faith so people will trust them and praise them for that faith. It's been very well noted that every US president and everyone who's ever been in the race for the White House always makes the big announcement about their faith. And this is simply because they have to do it, right? They've done the maths. They know statistically they simply cannot win if they don't get any of the Christian vote. So knowing that they would surely lose if they just came out and said, I'm an atheist, or I'm a Muslim, or I'm just simply not a Christian. As they know that they can't do that, then they go out of their way to persuade others, to put on a big show about how they follow God's ways. They try to look faithful even when they're not. But it's important to remember, it is not just those in the public eye that do this. Even many normal people, just living normal lives, can also put on a show of faith that isn't really about living for Jesus. And it's an easy mistake for people to make. They call it being a Sunday Christian. People who go to church and sing to God, they hear his word preached, but then they have nothing to do with him for the rest of the week. They look Christian on a Sunday when others are watching. But in the rest of the week, when no one's watching, they just live for the world. They don't care. And this is the warning that Jesus gives here. He's saying, don't be like that. Don't do anything just to show off for others. In fact, he actually says, do the opposite. He says, but when you pray, go into your room, close the door and pray to your Father who is unseen. Then your Father who sees what he's done in secret will reward you. So he's saying here, your relationship with God isn't a performance for everyone else. It is never for others to look at you and say, wow, you must be so faithful. Look how much you pray and go to church and read your Bible. You must be so faithful. I wish I was like you. Because just like giving to those in need for the sake of appearances, well, God cares nothing for this kind of behavior. He doesn't want us to be show-offs. He wants us to be genuine and do everything with a right heart. So doing things like what we've just looked at, giving to be seen, being Christian, praying up front only to be seen. Well, all that comes from pride. It's about appearance, not the reality. It's about being looked up to by others and caring more about what they think of you than what is actually true of you. And God, well, he only cares about what is real. He only cares about you doing these things because of your relationship with him, not to look good for others. Now, so far, we've looked at what the sin issue is. We've looked at how people go for appearances as opposed to being real. They are what Jesus calls them, hypocrites. People with what is a face mask, a false image, as they try to look one way when they don't actually live it. But that then raises the question, how is this particular issue a distorted gospel? How does a church teach this kind of thing? Because our series is about gospels that have been corrupted. They've been corrupted with lies which have been added to them. Whereas this here seems more like a personal moral failing as opposed to something that people are told to do. Because unlike the prosperity gospel or even the poverty gospel, this doesn't seem like something that would get taught from the pulpit. And the issue here seems to be that it is just people being fake. And that's something that can happen in any church, not because anyone is teaching that kind of thing. And no one is up front saying, pretend to be faithful, even if you're not. So surely this makes this a very different issue to the gospel that has had something intentionally added to it. And on the one hand, that is true. You don't often get people believing the prosperity gospel in churches that teach directly against it. But you do get people faking faith everywhere, even when they're told not to, even when they're told this is the wrong thing to do. So this is not something that is being taught, nor is it something that happens in only some bad churches. But even if it is a personal issue and not so much a directly proclaimed false gospel like the last couple that we've looked at, well, churches can still very much add to this problem. And they can add to it by their culture and the kind of teaching that they have. And it is probably in Presbyterian churches and churches like ours where we are more often to fall foul of this kind of problem. And it's an unfortunate consequence of trying to do the right thing. So as a denomination, we're considered to be very conservative and also theologically very highly regarded. When I was being interviewed to teach in an Anglican Bible college, the guy interviewing me was surprised that he had never come across me before. And then when he saw I was from a Prezi church, it was like he had come across special forces or something. It was like I was from some elite squad. He was like, "Oh, you're Presbyterian, no worries. There's obviously no question about your theology. You'll be fine at this. You'll be perfect for it." So we as a denomination, we actually have a good reputation in this regard, as we've seen to hold firmly to all of the Bible's teachings and to teach all that the Bible has to say and being very uncompromising about it. We don't distort it, we just teach the Bible clearly. And we also do have very high standards. Our church membership is often very regulated, and it's not just handed out lightly. And when it comes to things like how we do the sacraments, who we will marry, church discipline for those who publicly sin, we are certainly stricter than others. And there's no doubt there are many other churches, especially those larger inner city churches in the big capitals, that are much more likely to let things slip and would consider themselves and even pride themselves on being a broad church. And we're actually the opposite. We don't want to portray ourselves as a broad church. We're actually very narrow. We're saying this is what we hold to. And if you're a part of our church, you need to hold to that as well. So in this area of having standards, you would have to say we're doing something right. And this is not a bad thing, because as a church, we should be holding to a high standard, as we are called to cut off all sin. And it was only the chapter before our passage today that Jesus famously said to gouge out your eye and cut off your hand, as that is a better option than being thrown into hell. And we're told just before that we are to be a light to the world. And then just after our passage today, we're told to store up treasures in heaven and to not live for this life now. So we're being told very clearly to do our best, to cut off the worst and to live for Jesus each day. And this is something that as a church and as a denomination, we hold to, and therefore it's not something we should change. We should not soften our approach on this, as we need to hold each other accountable and encourage each other to do our best, to live for Jesus in every way. But there's no doubt that high standards can cause high pressure to conform. It can cause people to be quiet about their real life. And it can cause people to feel the need to put on an act and to not show their true self. That if they were to admit their struggles, if they were to admit that their faith was perhaps maybe running dry, that they would only face judgment and not support because they failed to come up to those standards. And the reason why some people feel that way is because they're not necessarily wrong. Some churches that do set a high standard have no time for anyone if they don't come up to that standard. That they take the idea of a little yeast works through the dough very seriously. So they demand almost what you would consider perfection in all parts of life and Christian faith. And if your standard becomes perfection, then the pressure to put on a show of perfection becomes not just desirable, but even mandatory. And then suddenly you have people making long prayers in public that they don't make in private. And people doing the Christian things for people to see and only for people to see. And the people who are the leaders in the church have to keep up the act more than anyone, because they not only have to play the game, but it's their job to deal with anyone who falls short of those standards. And then when you get to that point, then you're back here in this passage. You're back in the days of those in Israel just doing the cultural thing without any devotion. You're back in the days of the Pharisees, where people honor God with their lips, but their hearts are far from him. And this is why we then get what is the terrifying passage in the next chapter. This is Matthew 7, 21 to 23. We'll look at this one in more detail at the end of our series. We'll come back to this in a few weeks. But here we see in the run-up to this particular passage, Jesus talking about people taking the wide road instead of the narrow one, and how you can tell people by their fruit as it will show their true nature. And then straight after all that, he says, starting in verse 21, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. Many will say to me on that day, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name? And in your name drive out demons, in your name perform many miracles? Then I'll tell them plainly, I never knew you. Away from me, you evildoers. See, what's going on here is people have done the right thing. They've gone to church, they have prayed, they've helped the poor, they've read his word for people to hear. They've done all the things that Jesus said to do. And yet when they die and on the day they face judgment, Jesus will say, I never knew you. And why is that? Well, it's because they only did those right things to look the part. They only performed when people were watching. They were never genuine. And they never genuinely knew Jesus, so they never had real faith. From the outside, they're the Presbyterian who never misses a week of church. And they might even sit on some committee or even be an elder in that church. They looked the part. And they held to the high standard and made sure that everyone else was held to that standard. But it was all for show. And I say Presbyterian because, as I said before, it is in denominations like ours that do have high standards that can push people into falling into the trap of looking godly because we don't want to show our true weaknesses. Where people feel the pressure more to conform than actually live for Jesus out of sincere faith. And as also said before, it's not that we should lower our standards. It's not that we're wrong for saying, do your best every day. But this push has to come from a place of encouragement, not only judgment. Because if it's only the fear of the latter that motivates people, well, people will show their best as opposed to actually living it. They'll give you what you ask for. A good, devoted Christian who knows their Bible and expects the same from everyone else. But their motive for being that will come from a fear of not living up to the standard, or the desire to be seen as someone who does have it all together, and not someone who is actually broken and in need of Jesus' healing. But as we see in our passage today, if it's all show, it means nothing. If it's not genuine, it doesn't count for anything. So people don't grow in their faith. They just learn to play the game and put on a good show when it's required. It's like having a straight A student. They can get 100% every test. But if it's only because they've learnt the tricks of passing tests, which is a common thing in our education system. A lot of kids don't learn the subject, but they know how to cram and get the results. Or even worse still, they get 100%, not because they studied, but they just simply cheated and haven't actually learnt anything. So they may end up looking like top students, and yet they actually have no idea. The appearance becomes different to the reality because appearances becomes the goal. It's not to learn, It's just to look like you know everything. And it's the same kind of thing here. People worried about looking faithful as opposed to being faithful. Worried about looking the part and being an example of faith as opposed to actually growing. And unlike school or the working world, where you may be able to fake it until you make it, well, you can't fool God. You can't fake faith. Unless you're cutting off sin, unless you're changing your view of life and the world and developing a mind of Christ, then 10 or 20 or whatever years of faking it in church on a Sunday isn't going to bring you any closer to God. Because it simply doesn't work that way. It doesn't matter how you appear. It's about truly believing and living for Jesus. And you can only do that once you take the mask off and show where you are really at, not where you want people to see you at. Which means that the issue with the pride gospel is that it is simply not the real gospel. That since it's about creating an image and taking pride in that image and then protecting that image and letting that image define your faith, then it's no longer about a relationship with God. It's not about faith in Jesus. It's not about living for him. It's simply about looking good. It's nothing but appearances. It's wearing a mask, being a hypocrite. The more Christian you look, the more people buy it, the more faithful you must be. But true faith is just that. It's faith in Jesus. It's not about us looking good. It's not about us getting praise from people. It's about trusting in him and living for him, even if no one else sees what you do. Even if you have a bad image, if people have the wrong idea, it doesn't matter if you truly have your faith in him. I've heard many people say that not only would Paul never get a job as a minister in a church today, and when you look at the stuff Jesus did, he would probably get excommunicated by many churches these days. When we look at the stuff that Jesus did, we see that he was alone with a woman who had had 7 husbands, that he was sitting around talking to thieves, prostitutes, and all other outcasts of society. And this is why he ends up getting called a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners by the Pharisees and the other hypocrites that he's warning about here. And this is because they judged him on the image they perceived when he was actually nothing like that. And yet, despite the lies said about him, it's amazing how little he cared about his image and cared more for doing the right thing. Helping those people meant more to him than how he may look by those who only care about appearances. And it's the same kind of thinking that needs to apply to us today. Not in going out with the intention of bringing questions over ourselves by our actions, right? Not to make people doubt our faith, nothing like that. But to simply be genuine. Not acting for the purpose of building our image, but being genuine and honest and showing our real faith. Which means we all need to make sure that we don't get caught up in trying to look good. That we don't ever go to church just so others will go, wow, you must be really Christian. You know, you must be so faithful. You go there every Sunday. Instead, we do it because we want to know God. And because we know the true gospel. And we trust in Jesus to save us. And this means being honest with our struggles. And to do that with each other. So it actually points towards Jesus and our need for salvation in him. See, perfect people don't need saving. And if you act perfect, then that doesn't show what Jesus has done for you. Pride actually hides the work of Christ in your life. By hiding your failings, hiding your brokenness, you're hiding what Jesus has done to restore you. But humbly showing your need for him, it actually makes God's grace all the more apparent. When we show our weaknesses, when we are humble, it shows the world that we're not right with God because we're better. But we are right with God only because of the work of Christ and the fact that we've been saved by him and we've been changed, and one day we'll be made perfect and fully restored by him.